And good morning, everyone. My name is Evan Weiner. Thank you, Carla, for inviting me actually in 2020, but we never did anything in 2020 because of the pandemic. I will be free and clear as you could get, as my next shot is Wednesday, and I have April 7th marked on my calendar as the beginning of the return to normal for me, which will be 2 weeks after the shot. This is 1968 we're going back to, and my background is radio and TV. I started in 1971 up in Rockland County in Spring Valley, New York at Spring Valley High School when I was in 11th grade, about 30 miles north of Radio City and everything. And I was in 11th grade. Joe Dionisio was my teacher. And he said, "You got a good voice, student. How would you like to be in radio?" I said, "Yeah, in the worst way I want to be in radio." And I was. The high school showed Tiger Talk on WRKL 345 every Tuesday afternoon. Joe opened doors for me both in radio and newspapers. I also was working for the Nyack Journal News and the Bergen Record. And within 6.5 years, I was a year ahead. At the age of 21, I graduated college. I was barely 21. I was on WNEW radio in New York, William B. Williams and all that, doing news because John Lindsay told me he was running for Senate, state of New York in 1980, and started a 3.5-year stint doing some work for WNEW, where I interviewed not only John Lindsay, but Ronald Reagan and Ted Kennedy, and I was there when the hostages returned from Iran. We never spoke to them. We waved at them as their buses went by us, but I covered that story back then in January of 1981. This was a commission job from the Larchmont Library. They were doing a retrospective of the 1960s in 2018. During the month of April, and they asked me if I could, because they knew I had a radio and TV background, talk about the calendar year of 1968 from the TV and radio standpoint, because all of this came into your living room. And I don't think you had Barbara Walters changing the channel in your house. You might have had a TV that looked like that. I still have that stand. It's a great stand. It holds a lot of stuff. Hasn't broken. Anyway, Barbara was selling, I think it was Magnavox or whatever television that she was selling in 1968 while she was part of the Today Show. So make believe we're watching the Today Show a little bit, and make believe we go back to Barbara Walters and Hugh Downs and my old friend Joe Garagiola. And Frank Blair delivering the news, and you're waking up and you're hearing body counts at dawn. 1968 was probably the most turbulent year in the United States anyway of the swinging 60s, although there were a lot of changes, starting with the African countries becoming countries in 1960. Throughout the decade, John F. Kennedy assassinated. But 68's a big, big year because, and well, this is Zoom for you. Oh, wait, hey, Batman was still relevant in 1968. So I got a question for you. Who is the better Catwoman? Was it Julie Newmar? Because this was on the minds of people in 1968. Or was it Eartha Kitt? Give me 2 seconds to answer. If you don't have the answer, I will tell you. There was no comparison between the two, except that Eartha Kitt, in the beginning of 1968, January of 1968, on January the 19th. We got somebody in chat here. The first one, oh, Linda, you like Julie Newmar. Well, I'm going to tell you about Eartha Kitt, because Eartha Kitt was invited to the White House. Lady Bird Johnson was having a luncheon to honor successful women. And Eartha Kitt was a successful woman. And Eartha Kitt at that luncheon at the White House, hosted by Lady Bird Johnson, went up to Lady Bird Johnson, and some say it was disrespectful for her to have done this, but she went up to Lady Bird Johnson and asked this question: why are the boys still in Vietnam? There was a woman who corrected me, even though it was the Eartha Kitt quote, about 3 years ago when I was doing this talk. She said, "Don't say boys. There were women in Vietnam too. There were women who were secretaries. There were women who were administrative assistants. There were women who were nurses as well. In fact, the first journalist who was killed in Vietnam was Dickie Chappelle, who was killed in 1965, and she was buried with honors in Arlington National Cemetery. So there were women in Vietnam. But she asked a question. She didn't get an answer. Oh, yeah, she did get an answer from Lyndon Johnson. You've been blackballed. Lyndon called everybody he knew in the entertainment industry to make sure that Eartha Kitt would never work again in the United States after disrespecting Lady Bird Johnson, and Eartha Kitt had to go over to Europe, where she performed and acted until she came back to the United States about a decade later. So while Eartha Kitt was asking the question, why are we in Vietnam, there was another activity that was going down on the other side of Capitol Hill, on the other side of Pennsylvania Avenue, and it was the Jeannette Rankin Peace Parade. Now, Jeannette Rankin had been in Congress since 1917. Do the math, that was 51 years at this point. She was 87 years old, and she decides she's going to hold a women's only rally in front of the Capitol, about 5,000 women. And among the things that at least this banner will tell you is the war in Vietnam, and the war in Vietnam, and the social crisis at home, which is about the civil rights movement. And oh, by the way, there is a women's liberation movement that had started a few years back with Betty Friedan and the Feminine Mystique book, and then Gloria Steinem becoming a Playboy bunny and exposing the life of the bunny. And that all comes together in 1966. So you got three different things that these women are protesting. About 5,000 women are there. And the message is sisterhood is powerful. She was 87, Jeannette Rankin. She was a congresswoman from Montana who voted against the United States being in World War I. Think of this going back to 1917, which is now 104 years ago. World War I and World War II, and this was a protest while Eartha Kitt is talking to Lady Bird Johnson. A few days later, January 23rd, the war in Korea has never ended. There's been a truce since 1953. The North Korean United States first police action, now called the war, is still ongoing after 71 years, and it flares up occasionally, like it did in January of 1968, when North Korea seized the USS Pueblo and Lloyd Booker, who was the commander of the Pueblo. They took him and his crew as prisoners, and they took the ship. A year later, they would release Booker and his crew, but kept the ship, which is now a museum in North Korea. North Korea claimed that the ship violated its territorial waters while spying, which gave Lyndon Johnson another headache in Eastern Asia. Johnson was looking not only at Vietnam, but he was also looking at the Korean situation, North Korea, only a truce, and also there was no diplomatic relations between Red China, or the People's Republic of China. Stewie Gates, my old ninth grade teacher, would point this out to me all the time. It's Red China and it's Communist China. And China was having problems as well because it wasn't getting along with the Soviet Union. So Asia was a significant problem at that time. The Tet Offensive. The Viet Cong would launch the Tet Offensive against the South Vietnamese on January 30th. On January 31st, the Viet Cong soldiers, which formed in 1960, would attack U.S. soldiers at the embassy in Saigon. And the U.S. did actually rather well in the Tet Offensive, so well that Richard Nixon, who I knew because I covered him in 1985, 86, and 87, he knew my name, I knew his name. I called him President Nixon, and he said to me, "Oh no, it's Dick, call me Dick." Anyway, Dick Nixon thought that the Tet Offensive went so well that it would not be a campaign issue in 1968, that Vietnam would be taken off the table because the North Vietnamese were battered during the Tet Offensive. Of course, that didn't come to be. And while the Tet Offensive was going on, this guy, old Iron Pants, Walter Cronkite, the most trusted man in America, was in Vietnam, and he was shooting film to bring back to do a report on February 27th, which ultimately would be called the Report from Vietnam. But that's putting the horse ahead of the cart. By early February of 1968, only 35% of Americans approved Johnson's handling of the war. Now, this is a TV thing, right? So TV, the Vietnam War is being played out on TV globally. You get to see scenes of war every day, and you also every morning get to hear something called body counts at dawn. How many Viet Cong were killed? How many Viet Cong were wounded? How many Viet Cong we think are missing in action? How many Americans were killed? How many Americans were wounded? How many are missing in action? How many of the Allies killed? How many of the allies wounded, etc. And you heard that every morning. Every morning, if you listen to news radio or if you watch the TV shows, you heard body count at dawn. TV shows, basically in those days, a Today Show or some local news. So the Vietnam War is being played out on a daily basis, and we're coming up to Cronkite's report on February 27th. Now, when I'm live and speaking to groups like yours, I always get this big smile when I put up this picture, Tommy Smothers and Dickie Smothers. This is the limitation of Zoom because I can't go back and forth with you talking about Tom and Dick Smothers, and I can't do my joke as to, you know, some of the people that were on the show included Steve Martin. Whatever happened to Steve Martin, because I never heard from him again. Or Rob Reiner was one of the writers on the show. Whatever happened to Rob Reiner? And I get a laugh because people know what happened. In fact, Rob Reiner was on the Today Show this morning with Mel Brooks, which I missed, which is too bad because there's nothing funnier than watching Mel Brooks doing a TV interview. So Rob's still around. He was on the Today Show this morning, and I got to catch up with it later on YouTube. Anyway, the Smothers Brothers, they're on. And they're on for, they had started in 1967, and CBS wanted a very much younger and different audience than they had at that time. And they figured they have two young comics, Tommy Smothers, Dick Smothers, throw in the singing as well. They're a comedy duo. And they're going to get younger viewers. They're looking for viewers under the age of 35 with disposable income, who are living presumably in their own houses, have little kids, and can spend some money, because Ed Sullivan wasn't that anymore, nor was Red Skelton, nor was Lucy, or the Petticoat Junctions, Beverly Hillbillies, Green Acres shows as well. Well, Gilligan's Island was gone by this point. Mayberry RFD. They wanted something totally different, and they got it with the Smothers Brothers. They got the audience they want, but they also got something else that they didn't want, anti-war skits. And the Smothers Brothers, not only the other ones who are going after Johnson and are going after the war, also Rowan and Martin's Laughing, not at the same extent as the Smothers Brothers were, but they too were bringing up anti-war ideas, and their show is kind of an amalgamation of the old Ernie Kovacs show and some political satire from That Was the Week That Was, which was on NBC in 1964. Things come to a head with the Smothers Brothers in February of 1968. Tommy Smothers invites Pete Seeger on the show. Now, Pete Seeger was an all-out communist, and he was blacklisted in the 1950s. And William Paley, who founded CBS back in 1927 with a radio station in Philadelphia, wasn't too keen on having Pete Seeger on, but he and Tommy are going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And finally, Paley says, okay, you can have him on, but he can't sing one song. He can't sing one song, Waist Deep in the Big Muddy. And Tommy Smothers says, okay, so he can't sing Waist Deep in the Big Muddy. He goes to Pete Seeger, I want you to sing Waist Deep in the Big Muddy. And he performs it on the show on February 25th, 1968, one of the battles between CBS and the Smothers Brothers over Pete Seeger. The song was considered symbolic of the Vietnam War and Lyndon Johnson's policy of escalation, then widely seen as pushing the United States deeper into an increasingly unpopular war, with more demonstrations taking place, a lot more demonstrations taking place. The first demonstrations took place at the University of Wisconsin, real significant demonstration in October of 1967, and TV cameras were there to capture it. A remarkable piece of television history, the first week of February of 1968. Johnny Carson basically was apolitical. Oh, he would throw in a zinger here and there about whoever the president was, and he would create a toilet paper shortage around 1974 by saying he went to his local store and there was no toilet paper on the shelves, and people went to their stores and pulled the toilet paper off the shelves. But that's about as political as Carson ever got. But he knew things were going on in the country with the civil rights movement, with the women's liberation movement, and the Vietnam War. And he decided that he couldn't conduct interviews or really do justice to what was going on. So he turns the show over to Harry Belafonte for the week. And Ed McMahon is there. You can see here's Martin Luther King. Paul Newman is sitting there as well. And it was a week's worth of shows that you might have seen, say, on Mike Douglas, not Johnny Carson, because Mike would do that kind of thing. It was February 1968, and Carson sensed there was a national mood of swelling anger and division over race and Vietnam. So 5 nights, it's all yours, Harry Belafonte. It was February 5th to the 9th, and his guest list included Dionne Warwick, who is still around, Aretha Franklin, Martin Luther King, Senator Robert F. Kennedy, Lena Horne, Diane Carroll, Nipsey Russell, Bill Cosby, Buffy St. Marie, Aaron Williams, and Freda Payne. Carson thought it would be good for national conversation. It was a good TV show, and it's great to watch all of 53 years later about what happened at that time, but it had no sway. But this guy had some sway, maybe. Report from Vietnam, a major role with Walter Cronkite in turning Americans against the war and perhaps inducing Lyndon Johnson to abandon his re-election campaign. I say perhaps because David Halberstam in a book said so. But other people who I've known over the years, like Larry O'Brien, who is the commissioner of the National Basketball Association, who was part of Kennedy's Irish Mafia in Boston, who stayed on with Johnson and became his liaison to Congress. I did ask him this question per se, but when I knew Larry O'Brien, but I said, did Lyndon Johnson get pushed by Walter Cronkite in terms of not seeking re-election? And he said, I don't think Walter would have had that kind of influence on Johnson. But Walter was, Lyndon was known to call Bill Paley to complain about the Smothers Brothers. So who knows? Nobody seems to know. And there is Lyndon Johnson, who is running for president in 1968. And he's getting a push from Eugene McCarthy, who is the Dove candidate. That's what they were called in those days, anti-Vietnam, Hawks and Doves. And George Wallace has decided he is going to run for president down in the South in Alabama, but he's not seeking the Democratic primary. He's going to run as an independent, and potentially he can cipher off electoral votes from Johnson. February 12th is not a day that you remember unless you remember it's Lincoln's birthday and you took the day off back in 1968. But February 12th turns out to be a very important day in American history in 1968. That's when the Memphis sanitation strike starts. And the strike would begin on that day and would last until April 16th and have national consequences. About, let's say, 48, 52 days later after the strike started, 7 weeks after the strike started. On March 17th, Richard Nixon, I'm in Oregon. He's in Oregon. And he wins the Oregon primary, and he's told Bobby Kennedy enters the race against Lyndon Johnson. And Nixon says something quite striking. Oh, those Kennedys, something rather strange always happens when those Kennedys are around. Also on March 17th, first demonstration outside the United States with impact in London. It's against the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. 91 people in London are injured, 200 demonstrators arrested. On March 31st, the first of a 5-day period of turbulence in the United States, Lyndon Johnson says, I'm not running again. That's it, I'm done. Which leaves the door open to his vice president, Hubert Humphrey, to run. And there's Bobby Kennedy there, and there's Gene McCarthy, and there is George Wallace, and the presumptive nominee for the Republicans will be Richard Nixon, because he's pretty much running unopposed by this point. That's the Martin Luther King Center in Atlanta. I've been there twice, in 2004 and 2015. And that's my wife. I told my wife, she didn't come the first time because she was back in New York. I was down there on business. And I told my wife we're going there, and I didn't tell her anything about it, just let's go. And here's a picture of her with the people who are depicted as marching with Martin Luther King and others throughout the South from the late 1950s into the 1960s. And you walk into the center and you join these wax figures who are walking, and you're walking through all of the battlefields for the civil rights movement, Rosa Parks, etc., through the end of Martin Luther King's life, which is April 4th, 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee, where he's shot at the Lorraine Hotel by James Earl Ray, 6:01 in the evening Central Time, 7:01 New York time. Just an aside here, Steve Scott, if you listen to WCBS radio in the morning, Steve Scott, the anchor, was in Chicago many years ago doing his trade, reading news on WBBM. And he told me that he twice had an opportunity to interview James Earl Ray, the killer of Martin Luther King. He went down to the prison and he sat, and they brought James Earl Ray in. 2 45-minute sessions, and James Earl Ray stared at him for 45 minutes each time, never said a word. He never did get any response from James Earl Ray. And behind there is where Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King are buried. April 4th, 1968, Robert Kennedy is in Indianapolis. He is campaigning for the presidency, and he's going to tell the crowd, because there wasn't one of these back in those days, although if you had a transistor radio, you probably would have heard that Martin Luther King was killed if you carried the transistor radio around. And he tells the crowd that Martin Luther King is assassinated. And RFK is credited, is absolutely credited, with keeping the lid down on violence in Indianapolis that night. And I'm going to read the quote that is often attributed to keeping down the violence that night in Indianapolis. For those of you who are Black and tempted to be filled with hatred and distrust at the injustice of such an act against all white people, I can only say that I feel in my own heart the same kind of feeling. I have a member of my family killed, but he was killed by a white man. But we have to make an effort in the United States. We have to make an effort to understand, to go beyond these rather difficult times. And with that, Indianapolis remained as calm as can be. Meanwhile, up in Boston, the hardest working man in showbiz, I feel good, James Brown. He has a concert. And Kevin White is the mayor of Boston. And Kevin White and Boston leaders are not necessarily sure having James Brown in town giving a concert after Martin Luther King is killed is the best idea for Boston. Boston being a tough town for African Americans, as Bill Russell could tell you, and others. So James Brown is there, and he's going back and forth with Kevin White. We're going to do this. We're going to do this. We're going to do this. And James Brown tells Kevin White, I'm going to be able to control my people. You control your people. I'll get to control my people. And James Brown is in the middle of a concert. There's a little melee breaking out, and he yells, wait a minute. Now wait, step down. Now be a gentleman. Now I asked the police to step back because I think I could get some respect from my own people. Brown successfully restores order while keeping police away from the crowd. And he too is credited with keeping as much of a lid on the violence in Boston as possible. But that wasn't what happened around the rest of the country. There's Martin Luther King, and there's Jackie Robinson on the right. And the reason I bring this up is Jackie Robinson played for the Brooklyn Dodgers between 1947 and 1956 before Walter O'Malley traded him to the New York Giants for Don Littlefield. Jackie Robinson technically did not retire as a member of the Brooklyn Dodgers. He did as a member of the New York Giants. O'Malley couldn't stand Jackie Robinson, wanted to get rid of him, and finally did get rid of him. Jackie never played for the Giants. He ended up in Stamford, Connecticut, became a vice president of Chock full of Nuts, and lived up in Stamford, Connecticut, not far from where you are. Anyway, getting back to Walter O'Malley. Walter O'Malley moved the Dodgers to Brooklyn, from Brooklyn to Los Angeles at the end of the 1957 season. And there is a question as to what we should do in Major League Baseball with all the violence going on and the funeral coming up. Should we postpone the games on April 9th, or should we not postpone the games on April 9th? Well, here's the problem. The commissioner of baseball, William Spike Eckert, who was a general in the Army, but in baseball known as the unknown soldier, told the individual team owners, there were 20 teams in the league, or in both leagues at that point, so 10 owners were going to play on the day that Martin Luther King was being buried. He told the owners, do what you want. And O'Malley didn't necessarily want to cancel his game. Bill White was with the Philadelphia Phillies. I got to know him when he was the New York Yankees announcer. And we talked about this once. Bill White was leading the Philadelphia Phillies in a boycott. He told me that he had spent his career in the minor leagues and was subjected to Jim Crow, and even in the major leagues, subjected to Jim Crow, and that he was not going to play the day that they were burying Martin Luther King. And nor were his teammates with the Philadelphia Phillies. So Walter O'Malley, the Dodgers owner, former Brooklyn Dodgers owner, the team that hired Jackie Robinson, meets with his general manager, Buzzy Bavasi, on April 9th. Buzzy lays out the scenario, said, hey, we could play, Phillies are just going to forfeit, and we're going to look really bad. So O'Malley decided to postpone the game that day. Meanwhile, they couldn't play in Washington. That's Washington, D.C. Take a look at Washington, D.C. It looks like a war zone. It was the greatest wave at that time of unsocial rest around the United States since the Civil War. Some of the biggest riots took place in Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Chicago, where the mayor, Richard Daley, told his officers to shoot to kill. He wasn't going to allow anybody to sully Chicago's reputation. Kansas City, Harlem, and other places around the country. LBJ signed, through all this, LBJ signed another Civil Rights Act in 1968, which was supposed to prevent redlining by insurance companies, saying this is a bad insurance area, and then the real estate people would pick that up and say, yeah, well, let's bring people into this area, African Americans, and not into the good areas. And they passed a law which effectively prohibited housing discrimination based on race in 1968. Does the name Mark Rudd ring a bell? Now, pull out all those 1960s. Groovy, man, it's groovy. Hey, it's groove. Can you dig this? Can you dig Mark Rudd? Does Mark Rudd ring a bell? Well, Mark Rudd and the Students for Democratic Society, a group that Tom Heaton founded in 1962, decided to take over Columbia University, close down the administration buildings, and shut down the university for a week. I knew a woman who knew Mark Rudd. I was speaking at the Lester Tower in Whippany, New Jersey, and she said that Mark's parents lived in the same place that she did, in Lester Towers. And she said one day, Mr. Rudd's telling a story about Mark. He says, oh, that Mark, you know, he's leading away and they're in Washington. And he calls me up. He says, we're going to take over the Treasury building. He said, what for? Return it. You don't need the headaches. Just do what you want, but you don't need the Treasury building. Mark Rudd and his cohorts shut down Columbia University. The United States wasn't the only one seeing unrest. In France, you could read, if you know French, it says, stop the intentional bombing of the North Vietnamese. Of course, the French pulled out of Vietnam in 1954 and left behind a civil war. they decided to get out of the colony in 1954, and the United States slowly filled the gap that the French left. But there was more to it than protesting against Vietnam. There were demonstrations, general strikes, occupations of universities and of factories. And Charles de Gaulle decided, the leader of France, decided once and for all, he is going to sit down and he's going to talk to these people, and they work out some sort of an agreement that there would be a referendum on reforms. He's going to put together the referendum, and if they vote for his reforms, he'll stay in 1969. It was April of 1969 when they had the vote. But if they vote against me, and they did 52.8 to 47.2 in April of 1969, I'll get off the stage. And he did. The people, the socialists, it was a socialist, basically a socialist idea. The people said, we've had enough of de Gaulle, and they voted his package out. And that was the end of Charles de Gaulle in 1969. Now let's get back to Bobby Kennedy. And I have, to the assassination, I have two tangential links to that assassination. One, my friend Shelley Saltman, who was friends growing up with Leonard Nimoy up in Massachusetts, and Barbara Walters was in his class at high school and up in Boston. Also Barry Morse, the actor, and David Susskind was up there, and Leonard Bernstein. Leonard Bernstein's mother used to play Marjan with Shelley's mother and David Susskind's mother in Boston. Anyway, Andy Williams was Bobby Kennedy's best friend. And Shelley was in sports promotion at this point, and he had his own promotion company, and he was working with Andy Williams on the San Diego Open. Shelley worked with a lot of golfers at that point. Jackie Gleason would be one, Sammy Davis Jr. up in Hartford when he hosted the Hartford tournament, and others. Anyway, Andy calls Shelley up, and he says, listen, Bobby's in town. You know, it's the end of the California primary, and he needs a place. He needs a place where he needs to sit down and he needs to write two speeches. One is, we win, we go on. The other is, well, we lost tonight, but don't give up any hope. We're going to keep carrying on. And he says, I need a quiet place. Can you put me up somewhere? And he says, yeah. He says, I'm going to Denver today. You know where my office is. Just tell my secretary. Just bring Bobby up there. Tell my secretary and lock him in my room. Nobody's going to bother him. And so that happened. Bobby went into Shelley's room, wrote his final two speeches at Shelley's desk. And he had them in his pocket, one if he's going to win, one if he's going to lose. And that was Shelley. Also, Shelley was part of the St. Patrick's Cathedral train ride to Arlington National Cemetery. He helped organize that as well after RFK was assassinated. And the other is Rosie Greer, who played with the New York Giants and the Los Angeles Rams, about 6'5", 300 pounds. And this is about 1982, 1983, and I am covering something. And Rosie put out a book on knitting. And sometimes to get to what you want to get to as a reporter, if it's a promotion like Rosie talking about his knitting book, you ask a couple of questions about the book, and then you get into what you really want to talk about, which to me was, you were the bodyguard for RFK, you and Rayford Johnson in California. The thinking was that they were the bodyguards. They were huge guys, and Bobby was only about 5'7", that they would be able to protect him because they were big, big guys. So you're the bodyguard, and Kennedy gives the speech, the victory speech at the Ambassador Hotel, and then goes and through the hotel, through the pantry, because politicians don't go through crowds, they go through places where there are no crowds allowed. And so he gets there, and Sirhan Sirhan, by the way, today is Sirhan Sirhan's birthday. He was born on the same day as Adolf Eichmann, for those keeping score at home, March 19th. But anyway, what happened? He's walking by there, the shots ring out, and Rosie knocks the gun, gives Sirhan a chop on the arm, breaks his arm, the gun goes flying. And I said to Rosie in this interview, what possessed you to do that? And he says, I don't know to this day. This is 1983, 84, 16 years after it. And he said, I don't know. And he's lived with the guilt. Could I have done something? So did Rayford Johnson, because I knew Rayford, some of his friends. And they live with the guilt. Could we have done something? Could we really have done something to prevent the shooting? Now, of course, the question always is, would Bobby Kennedy gotten the Democratic nomination? I'll get to that in a couple of minutes. Meanwhile, this is Prague, Czechoslovakia. It's the Prague Spring. 3 years ago, about this date 3 years ago, I speak on cruise ships. I was on a celebrity cruise ship down in the Caribbean, and I did this talk, and there was a woman who was sitting in front of me. We were in the side lounge. She was in her walker. And she says, and I could hear her, she says, "Oh, that looked beautiful." And I looked at her and I said, "Were you there?" She said, "Oh, yes, I was. I was in Bratislava, Czechoslovakia." And I said to the crowd, I said, "That's it. We're done talking. I can't top her. I'm going to sit down. My background, as you know, is radio, TV, journalism, newspapers, magazines. We're going to sit down. I'm going to have a chat with her, and you're welcome to listen in." And if the cruise director comes in, just said, he's bored and he wanted to talk, he wanted to hear her story. But anyway, she was telling me the story. She's in Bratislava, Czechoslovakia, and she says it was beautiful. It was absolutely beautiful. She said that the poets were writing poetry, the guitar players are in the cafes playing their music. She got a visa. She could go to Brussels in October of 1968. And it was great. She said, for the first time, we had some freedom in not looking over our shoulder. And then she says, here comes August 20th. It's August 20th, and she's living with her mother in a flat in Bratislava, Czechoslovakia. And she says her mother is near the window. And she says, "Oh, what are airplanes doing flying overhead in Bratislava, Czechoslovakia on August 20th, 1968? She pulls the curtain. She says, "What are tanks doing in the streets of Bratislava, Czechoslovakia at 11 o'clock on August 20th. And obviously the Soviets decided to put the boot to the neck of the Prague Spring, and it ended. And she said she felt sorry for the young Soviet troops there because it was hot and they were in these hot tanks and all this other stuff. And you felt sorry for them because they probably didn't want to be there, but they were there. And they couldn't drink because if you gave them something to drink, they might have been shot on the spot. As far as this woman goes, she spent another couple months in Bratislava. She had the ability to go to Brussels, that she was going with her mother. And they concocted a plan. And the plan was they had relatives in Skokie, Illinois, and they were going to go, as soon as they got to Brussels, to the American embassy, ask for asylum, and within 72 hours, they were in Skokie, living a different life. And she told me she eventually went back, but she was happy that she was able to escape Czechoslovakia. So that starts January 5th, 1968. Alexander Dubček was elected the first secretary of the Communist Party, and that all ends October 21st. Eventually, Dubček would die mysteriously in a car crash. That's Pol Pot. He is the head of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. The Khmer Rouge is formally officially formed and launches an insurgency against Cambodia. They get an ally in Ho Chi Minh in North Vietnam, and they would allow Ho Chi Minh to use routes that would bring ammunition into South Vietnam. They'd give some weapons to the Khmer Rouge, and eventually Richard Nixon would decide to bomb Cambodia, which would lead to the Kent State killings and the Jackson State killings in May of 1970, but that's another talk. These guys, the Beatles, these guys decide that they are going to do something about the Vietnam War and speak out against it. At least John Lennon does, and he does with a song called Revolution, which is a mess lyrically, absolute mess lyrically, but it's considered an anti-something song. This is where the rock culture meets the folk culture, which meets the protesters. This song in 1968, Say You Want a Revolution. Well, you can count me out, you can count me in. Lennon's undecided. Next year, he would write the song, Give Peace a Chance. So, was rock music the soundtrack of the global protest? Well, I do ask this question when I'm live, but Zoom has a lot of limitations, so I don't. It was. Rock musicians replaced the folkies like Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, Tom Paxton, Country Joe and the Fish, Peter, Paul and Mary, Pete Seeger, and they become very prominent in the anti-war movement. The cultural protests merged with the political demonstrations. I'm going to be the president. Well, at least I think I am. That's Richard Nixon accepting the Republican nomination for president. And to his right is Gerald Ford, who has this kind of quizzical look on his face, like, I know something you don't know. So Nixon's the one. Nixon's going to be the Republican standard bearer, along with Spiro Agnew as the ticket for the Republican Party. Meanwhile, the Democratic presidential nominee has still not yet been decided. It would be in Chicago, and it won't be Pegasus the Pig. Pegasus the Pig was arrested as part of a demonstration against the Democratic convention in Chicago. Pegasus, his wife and kids were all arrested. We don't know if they became dinner that night or lived out their lives on an Iowa farm. Political theater as the Yippies, the Youth International Party, Jerry Rubin, Abby Hoffman, nominate a pig for president. August 23rd, 1968. Pegasus arrested along with Jerry Rubin, all charged with disorderly conduct. Humphrey is apparently going to be the Democratic nominee, outlasting Eugene McCarthy, and George Wallace is not involved. Now, the question always is, had Bobby Kennedy not been assassinated, would he have been the nominee? I usually open it up to the floor. We have a back and forth with people who were around back in those days. And some people would say yes, and some people would say no. From the people that I spoke to over the years, and some of Kennedy's people included these people who you might have heard of, Jerry Springer, Bob Arum, later becoming the boxing promoter, Jeff Greenfield, who became a television commentator, political commentator, three of the people who were there. And they were all rather young, and they weren't all part of the establishment. Johnson had the establishment, which meant Humphrey had the establishment. Johnson hated the Kennedy family. There was no love lost between the Kennedy family and the Johnson family. Now, the assumption was Johnson was going to win, and he couldn't serve another term after that. So Kennedy is kind of positioning himself to be the front runner in 1972. Unless there was a deal brokered in some back room, the Johnson people were going to control the convention, and Humphrey was going to be the Democratic candidate. Meanwhile, there were protests in the streets of Chicago. Richard Daley did not want anybody to sully the name of Chicago. Vietnam War, the significant issue. Daley was having some problems with the protesters. He got word that some of the protesters got a big truck, and they were going to load it with LSD, and they were going to take it over to the Lake Michigan water supply, dump all the LSD into the water, and then all of Chicago would act like Groucho Marx, because Groucho Marx was one of the first proponents of taking LSD back in the 1940s. Well, that didn't materialize, but this did. And back on that cruise that I was on back 3 years ago, there was a woman who came to my talk so she can hear me talk about Chicago, because she wanted to say something. She was on top of the Hilton Hotel, and she said she had a room there. I don't know why she was there, but she was there, and she said she was looking down. This woman was about 75 3 years ago. And she said she was looking down, and she could see the protesters on one side, the cops on the other side, each side inching for a battle. And she said, we kept hearing, the whole world is watching, the whole world is watching, the whole world is watching. Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin had vowed to lead the Vietnam protesters to Chicago to disrupt the convention. Daley said, nothing, absolutely nothing. I am going to do everything I can to make sure my city's good name remains its good name. Meanwhile, Walter Cronkite, old Iron Pants, is over at the amphitheater in the meatpacking district of Chicago, where the arena was, and CBS is covering the Democratic National Convention, and Mike Wallace and Gunga Dan Dan Rather, Gunga Dan are roughed up. Here's the difference between 1968 television reporting on news and 2021. Listen to what Cronkite says. I think we've got a bunch of thugs here, if I may be permitted to say so. He is asking you, the audience, can I say that? Whereas today, and I've done these shows, I've been a pundit on MSNBC, also on Sam Donaldson, ABC News show with Sam Donaldson, who liked me actually. And anyway, they encourage you, not the Donaldson show, but on MSNBC and other shows I've been on, to be combative. And facts, well, facts be damned, be combative. No, it's you, no, it's you, no, it's you, yo, it's you. Back in 1968, it was more of the Joe Friday approach, just the facts, ma'am, just the facts. It's August 28th, and the TV cameramen are in the Conrad Hilton Hotel, and they turn their cameras down to the crowd. The whole world's watching, the whole world's watching. I was on that cruise ship, and there was a guy there who said, I was very upset about this. I said, why were you upset? He said, I was 16 years old. I wanted to play softball. I couldn't play softball in Grant Park. I said, oh, you were the one that brought the Ham's beer down, weren't you? And he said, how'd you know? I said, I could just tell. I could just tell you were the one. Anyway, so here we go, and the battle begins. The Chicago Tribune, which is hardly a vestige of the liberal media. In fact, it's very conservative. Colonel McCormick ran the Chicago Tribune back in the day, in the 1930s and 1940s, and he was a member of the America First Committee. It's very conservative, was a very conservative newspaper back in the day. This is what they said. Many convention visitors were appalled at what they considered the unnatural enthusiasm of the police for the job of arresting demonstrators. Oh yeah, there's Richard Daley, and this was directed at one of yours in Connecticut, Senator Abraham Ribicoff. Ribicoff was giving a talk about the Gestapo tactics that the Chicago police were using against the demonstrators, and Daley had enough. He wanted to cut off Ribicoff from probably more than just not speaking. I think he wanted to cut off his head. He did everything he could to curtail the voices of those speaking out against the war. There were major arrests, the Chicago 8. Abby Hoffman, Tom Hayden, David Dillinger, Rennie Davis, who recently passed away, John Frones, Jerry Rubin, Lee Weiner, no relation to me, and Bobby Seale. Bobby Seale would be cut from the Chicago 8 because of his antics in the courtroom, so it would become the Chicago 7. In February of 1970, the case is disposed of. 5 of the remaining Chicago 7 conspirators were convicted of the intent to incite a riot while crossing state lines. That would be overturned in 1971 on appeal. Oh, here are some women from New York, and they look like a nice bunch of women just sitting around and, you know, just talking and all. But they're plotting, and these are feminists. And on October 22nd, these women are called the New York Radical Women. And they invited women of every political persuasion to the Atlantic City's boardwalk on September 7th, which was the day of the Miss America contest. They would protest the image of Miss America. That image oppresses women in every area in which it purports to represent us, including a Burn the Bra campaign. When I'm live, I ask women of a certain age if they burn their bra. And I don't get the, you can't ask me that. I get the, are you crazy? You know how much a bra costs? You know how hard it is to fit? You're a man, you don't know what's going on. You really don't know what's going on. I get that. It was a successful campaign. The protest would feature a freedom trash can, because you couldn't put anything on fire on the Atlantic City boardwalk, into which women could throw away all the physical manifestations of women's oppression, such as bras, girdles, curlers, false eyelashes, wigs, and representative issues of Cosmopolitan, Betty Friedan, and Bella Abzug, and Gloria Steinem absolutely hated Helen Gurley Brown and her vision of women, Ladies' Home Journal, Family Circle, etc. And there is the Freedom Trash Can, where people threw in their physical manifestations. In fact, you got one woman back there who's wearing her bra outside of her dress, because apparently she's about ready to throw it out. Well, the campaign was very successful in that it didn't change Miss America, but it got men's attention to the plight of women. They probably were titillated by the fact that women were throwing their bras away. The 1968 protest didn't change the Miss America pageant. Burt Parks would still be there for a long time. Burt used to live in Greenwich, Connecticut, for those of you keeping score at home. But it did introduce feminism into the mainstream consciousness and expand the national conversation about the rights and liberation of women. What they did was because they used "let's burn your bra" as a campaign message, as the message, they got men to at least listen to the protest. And eventually it would work, because by 1972, women did get an equal opportunity at higher education in the United States with men. That didn't happen in 1968. Oh, why is that man smiling? Oh, sock it to me. Sock it to me. Richard Nixon's on Rowan and Martin's laughing. And again, he changes politics in terms of television. He did inadvertently in 1960 when he looked terrible and the first debate with John Kennedy. And here he opens the door for everybody else to show a sense of humor, which is odd because I knew Nixon and he had no sense of humor. But he was on Sock It To Me. Smothers Brothers had to give their shows in 10 days in advance. So the censors, there is censorship in TV, so the censors could thoroughly vet them. And they did. But they had Pat Paulson on the air. Pat ran for president in 1968, the first comic to do that. Stephen Colbert didn't do that. And he used to write, he used to have these editorials where he could speak on issues out of both sides of his mouth. I used to send away for a self-addressed stamped envelope to get those. I don't know what happened to them. They've been lost in the midst of time. He was cast as their editorialist. His deadpan double-take comments on the issue of the day. Oh, by the way, in 1968, Harry Belafonte was supposed to be on the Smothers Brothers, a 4.5-minute segment singing "Don't Stop the Music" with a montage of what was going on in Chicago behind him. CBS snipped that out and put in 4.5 minutes of Richard Nixon political commercials. There you go. Jose Feliciano sung the national anthem before Game 5 of the World Series between the St. Louis Cardinals and the Detroit Tigers in Detroit. Look at Jose, and look at the guys behind them. They look like they're a VFW band behind Jose, backing band behind Jose. That was October 7th, and he sings the Star-Spangled Banner to a new tune with a Latin jazz twist. The crowd immediately responded with cheers and boos. Callers into NBC and into Tiger Stadium thought that Feliciano, the Puerto Rican, not American, the Puerto Rican, because they didn't think he was an American citizen, they thought his version of the national anthem was unpatriotic. 3 years ago, Jose Feliciano came back to Detroit to perform the same national anthem prior to a late season Detroit Tigers game. In Mexico, there is a problem. Again, socialism, inequality, same things that people were complaining in France, except the Olympics are 3 weeks later. There was a group called the CNH made up of students from 70 universities and preparatory schools. They coordinated with a big Mexico City protest to promote social, economical, educational, and political reforms. It's October 2nd. There are 10,000 university and high school students in the plaza, and the government decides to come in and kind of end the demonstration. And how they did that was with tanks and all. And the official story is that they heard that the groups were going to turn against one another, and they were there to protect the groups. There were hundreds who died, thousands who were injured. But the official story is we were there just to protect you, not to break them up. But the Mexico City Olympics in 1968, Tommy Smith in the middle, John Carlos on the right, Peter Norman on the left. They are in the race, and Peter Norman suggests to Carlos and Smith after the race is done and Smith wins, split your gloves. Smith gives Carlos his left glove. You could see on Carlos's, in front of Carlos, there were beads. They were in a protest against poverty, against lynching, not against lynching. You can't see that they're not wearing shoes against poverty, and they're trying to bring attention to the plight of African Americans in the United States. Peter Norman would suffer the most because he would become a non-citizen in Australia for helping out or help coming up with a protest. He would die in 2006. In 2012, the Australian Parliament said, we're sorry we made you a non-citizen. The three were supporting the Olympic Project for Human Rights. Well, the election comes and Nixon wins. Humphrey loses. Winning is more fun, said Humphrey, as he concedes. Nixon wins. George Wallace does pull electoral votes out of Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, Arkansas. Probably in Louisiana, probably wouldn't have made any difference because Nixon was going to win anyway. And then there was some suggestion that Nixon played fast with the rules and actually had some conversation with Claire Chennault's widow from the Burma Hump in World War II, Claire Chennault and the Flying Tigers, and may have talked to the North Vietnamese about wait until after the election, maybe we'll give you a better deal, sabotaging the talks between the United States and North Vietnam. There's a lot of hearsay on that, but no real evidence. It might have happened. Nixon told Johnson, I didn't do it, but he wins. Why did Humphrey lose? Well, maybe because of the Vietnam War, because he refused to break with Johnson on the course of action in Vietnam. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Elvis is back in the building. It's October. It's actually in June of 1968. And Elvis is taped. He puts on the leather outfit, straps on the guitar, and it's 1956 all over again. The show is taped. He does about 3 hours, only about an hour gets on the air on NBC, and it is shown on December 3rd, the Elvis Comeback Special, sponsored by the Singer Sewing Machine Company. Thank you very much. And then he goes off to Vegas and wears capes and sings My Way. We end 1968 with Frank Borman and Bill Anders and Jim Lovell. They are circling the moon in the Apollo 8 spacecraft. They weren't supposed to do this. The lunar module wasn't ready out in Bethpage. Grumman didn't have it ready yet, so they changed the mission and they fly around the moon. And they fly around the moon on Christmas Eve. And they read from Genesis and basically said, the Earth is good. Don't mess with it. Don't mess with it. My friend Dick Hull, who now lives near the Kennedy Space Center, who I worked with a project on 10 years ago or so, worked for NASA between 1960 and 1974. And Dick told me, and he worked on the Neil Armstrong lunar landing, which is a great story for 2 other talks because the video came in upside down from the moon, and Dick had to straighten it out. But anyway, he said that of all the letters that ever came into NASA following any missions, including Apollo 11, where Neil Armstrong landed on the moon, the one that got the most mail was this one, Apollo 8, because Borman, Lovell, and Anders read passages from the Bible and said, let it be, let the earth be, let it be peaceful. The problems of 1968 would not end on December 31st. 1968 would shape generations to come, and in some ways still does. Thank you, Carla, for inviting me. I am going to open the floor for everybody now. I'm going to stop the recording actually, so if anybody has any questions, don't worry about being seen. You're not going to be seen. And I'm going to turn the floor over to you. Again, thank you, Carla. My name is Evan Weiner.